I have worn ceremonial shell plate since I was 14 years old. That is the fact no one in the Solene court states plainly, because stating it plainly would require acknowledging why. The official reason, the one my chamberlain rehearsed until she could deliver it without looking away, is that the Velcarin subdermal plating presents a significant visual stimulus in mixed-species diplomatic contexts, and that the armor, the ceremonial grade, the pale lacquered shell plate my house has dressed, its heirs in for 4 generations, provides the delegation chambers with a unified aesthetic that supports productive discourse. What she means is this. When I feel something, my skin shows it. Not in the way human faces show it, a reddening, a trembling of the jaw. The bioluminescent plating beneath my outer skin is old, older than my house, and it does not consult my wishes before responding. Calm is a steady pearl blue. Grief is a low, slow pulse of violet. Anger runs amber through the subdermal channels so quickly that the humans in the room sometimes raise a hand to shade their eyes before they have consciously registered what they are shading them from. And delight, when I have felt, it is gold. Deep, warm, moving gold, like firelight seen through river water. The court finds it unsettling. The court finds me unsettling. They have dressed the unsettling thing in shell plate and called it dignity, and I have worn it for 8 years because I was 14 and new to the title, and it seemed, in those first months, like the most reasonable accommodation a young princess could make. I did not understand yet that accommodations, once made, become walls. I understood it the afternoon I went to Valeth. The Valeth estate sits in the lowland province, 4 hours from the capital by ground rail. It is a minor posting. The house maintains it because abandoning an estate is untidy, not because the estate matters. There are 3 groundskeepers, a small household staff, and a walled garden that has been producing the same varieties of climbing vine and flowering herb for 40 years, supplying the capital house with dried cuttings that no one in the capital house particularly uses. I was sent there in the early weeks of the Calder trade negotiation, when my senior chamberlain, Thar, determined that the presence of my armor light at the delegation table was, and he used this word with the delicacy of a man placing something breakable on a shelf, complicated. The human delegation's lead minister had apparently made an informal remark, third hand, about the difficulty of reading a counterpart's expression when that counterpart was, in his phrase, somewhat luminous. Thar arranged my inspection tour of the provincial estates within 48 hours. It was not framed as removal. It was framed as an opportunity for me to develop a fuller picture of the Solene holdings during a period when the capital negotiations required a more contained diplomatic environment. I was 22. I had been wearing shell plate since I was 14. I knew exactly what I was being sent away, to spare the humans the discomfort of. I went. I did not argue. Arguing would have illuminated me in ways the shell plate was specifically designed to prevent. The Valeth garden is enclosed by a stone wall, so old that moss has colonized every horizontal joint. The wall holds warmth, the way old stone does. It catches afternoon sun and releases it slowly into the evening, and the climbing vines along the inner face grow dense and dark green, and improbably lush for a lowland, posting no one particularly tends. There is an attached glass house at the east end, half the size of the garden itself, where the groundskeepers winter the tender varieties and propagate new cuttings and do whatever groundskeepers do in the long, slow months when nothing is growing. The estate steward, a small, efficient woman named Terrason, met me at the gate with a prepared welcome and a briefing document. I thanked her. I declined the briefing document. I said I would like to walk through the garden. She looked briefly at the shell plate on my arms and nodded and said, of course. I walked through the garden alone, which was unusual enough that Terrason hovered at the far end of the path until I made it clear, with no particular sharpness, that I meant alone. She retreated. My 2 security escorts took positions at the wall gates, as they had been trained to do when I indicated I wanted to be unwatched without being unprotected, and for a few minutes, I stood in the center of the walled garden in the early afternoon light and listened to the quiet. There was a man at the far end of the garden, near the glasshouse entrance, who had not stopped working when I came in. I noticed him the way you notice something that should have shifted and didn't. Everyone shifts when I enter a room. The shell plate catches light, and there is something in the bearing of my people. The Velcaran line runs tall, even the shorter of us, that makes the shift happen whether I want it to or not. But this man had his back to me, and he was working at a raised bed of herbs with a short-handled tool. And when I crossed through the garden gate, he did not turn around. I thought, for a moment, that he hadn't heard. Then I thought, he heard. He simply kept working. I walked toward the glasshouse end of the garden, not because I particularly wanted to see the glasshouse, but because that was the end of the garden that did not yet have someone in it who had stopped what they were doing to watch me. And I had had enough of being watched for a while. The gravel path had gaps where the flagstones were loose, and the edges of the raised beds were overgrown with something low and sprawling that smelled strongly of crushed green, and the whole garden had the feeling of a place that was tended carefully, but not made elegant. The kind of tended where someone cared about the plants, more than about the impression. The man with the short-handled tool was perhaps in his late 6th decade. His hands were the kind that had been useful for a long time, wide at the knuckle, with the deliberate economy of movement that comes not from training, but from years of doing one thing, until doing it well, became doing it without thinking. He was working the soil between rows of something low and silver-leafed, and he was doing it with a focus that made clear the work mattered to him, and the interruption did not. I stopped a few feet away. I was between him and the sun, and a small part of my shadow fell across the bed he was working in. He looked up then. His eyes moved to my face first, not to the shell plate, which was not what I was accustomed to. Most people's eyes move to the shell plate first. It's where the light is, if I am feeling anything at all. And in those days I was almost always feeling something I was trying not to show, which meant the channels were running a suppressed dim blue that still caught the sun. He looked at my face, and his expression was the ordinary expression of a man who has just noticed that someone has come to stand in his light, and who is waiting to determine whether they are going to want something. He said, "Afternoon." I said, "Afternoon." He looked back at his work. I stood there for a moment, not sure what I was doing, and then I sat down on the stone bench at the end of the raised bed, because my feet ached from the estate walk, and the bench was there, and I was, for once, not in a delegation chamber where sitting uninvited would constitute a protocol incident. He did not remark on this. For a while we existed in the same quiet. He worked. I sat. The sun moved. A bird I didn't know the name of landed on the wall and sang 4 notes, and then flew off, apparently satisfied. The smell of the garden soil and crushed herb and old stone warming in the afternoon was the cleanest smell I had encountered in months, because the delegation chambers always carried something underneath the formal air, the specific anxiety smell of many species, all trying very hard to appear relaxed. After perhaps 10 minutes, he said, without looking up, "You're from the Capitol House." "Yes," I said. "Inspection tour?" "Something like that." He made a small sound that was not disagreement and not agreement, but some third thing acknowledgement without judgment. He worked for another minute, and then sat back on his heels and looked at the row he'd been working with, the satisfied expression of someone assessing a problem they've just resolved. "Edric Tavn," he said, which I understood to be his name. "Reth Solane," I said, which was my name without the title, the way I'd been giving it in the provincial estates when I could get away with it. He didn't react to the name in any way that suggested he knew it. He might have. The Solane line is not unknown, even in the lowland province. But if he knew it, he gave no sign. And the absence of the knowing, look, the small recalibration people make when they realize they are in proximity to someone who can affect their lives, was so unfamiliar to me that I felt the bioluminescent channels shift, slightly under the shell plate, Something trying to come up. I pressed it down. He said, "You know anything about climbing vines?" I said, "No." "That," he said, and pointed at the south-facing wall, "is Velarath thornless. 60 years old, that specimen. The original planting was 3 cuttings from the Capitol glass house, which had them from somewhere else. I've never gotten the full provenance. It produces almost no flowers, and it doesn't fruit, so it's completely useless by any commercial measure. But it's not here to be useful." He looked at it with the same expression he'd used on the herb row he'd just finished. Satisfied assessment. "It's here to be the wall." I looked at the vine. It covered the south wall in a deep green mass, the stems layered and interwoven until the individual plants were impossible to distinguish from one another, the whole thing moving slightly in the low afternoon wind, as though it were one organism. It was, I realized, extremely beautiful in the specific way that things are beautiful when they have been allowed to do what they do for 60 years, without anyone deciding they should be doing something else. "How long have you worked here?" I asked. 8 years, he said. "Before that I was in the Capitol. Archivist's office. 31 years. That landed with a small precision in my chest. 31 years in the archivist's office would have meant 31 years cataloging the things the Solane House considered worth cataloging. The covenant stones, the treaty documents, the species records, the provenance rolls that traced every artifact in the house collection back through hands and centuries. He would have handled, in those 31 years, records that touched every corner of the house's history. He would have known the name Reth Solane from before I was born. I said, carefully, "What brought you out to Valeth?" He lifted his chin toward his hands. "Arthritis. The fine work needed finer hands than I still had. They offered me a pension, and I said I'd rather have the garden posting." He looked at his hands for a moment, the wide, deliberate knuckles with a kind of calm regard, the way a man looks at a tool that has served him well even if it no longer fits the finest work. "Better out here." I sat with that for a moment. I understood something about making accommodations and how they become walls. I understood less, then, about the other kind of accommodation, the kind you make to yourself, choosing a smaller and quieter life because it is a life you can actually inhabit. I was learning. He went back to work. I stayed on the bench. At some point, Terrace On appeared at the far end of the garden path, saw me on the bench, and Edric Tavin working at the raised bed, and made the rapid judgment of a good estate manager, that whatever was happening was not a problem, and retreating was more useful than intervening. She retreated. I was grateful to her. The afternoon wore on. I had not sat still in afternoon sun for long enough to feel warm in 4 or 5 months. The shell plate heated slowly in the sun, which is a sensation not unlike a long bath, a full-body warmth that the armor was not, actually, designed to manage, being made for indoor delegation chambers where the climate was controlled, the gauntlets especially. The shell plate gauntlets, which covered my hands to the mid-forearm, were heavier than the rest of the armor by design, the hands being the most communicative part of the Velcaron body after the face, the plating there the most responsive to emotional state. The court had had them made half again as thick as the arm and shoulder pieces. In the sun, they were, I realized, becoming uncomfortable. I did not say anything about this. I did not move from the bench. I sat in the warming sun and listened to Edric Tavin work, and thought about the vine that had been allowed to be exactly what it was for 60 years, which was just a wall. He moved to the glass house after perhaps another half hour, propping the door open with a flat stone so the air could move. I heard him inside the sound of clay pots, the low scrape of soil, something being poured from something else. He came back out with a small terracotta pot in one hand, the thumb-sized start of something rooting in dark soil, and set it on the edge of the raised bed nearest the glass house entrance. "Cutting of the thornless," he said, without particular ceremony. "From 2 seasons back, it's taken. Needs another month in the pot before it'll want a wall." I looked at it. The stem was barely thicker than a finger, pale green, with 3 small leaves. "What do I do with it?" I asked. "Give it wall space and leave it alone," he said. "It knows what it's doing." I almost smiled at that. The channels stirred again, under the shell plate. I felt the warmth behind my sternum. That means something is trying to be gold. The right gauntlet chose that moment to make a sound. It was a small, high sound, not dramatic, not alarming, the sound of a stress fracture in the outer lacquer layer finding its final angle. The shell plate gauntlets of the ceremonial grade are made, at their innermost layer, of a material that responds to sustained heat stress by releasing the pressure along pre-scored fracture lines. It is a safety feature. It is designed to prevent the armor from becoming a trap. I knew this, in an abstract way, the way I knew most things about the armor, as a fact provided to me when I was 14 and had never needed since. The right gauntlet's outer layer opened along the back of my hand, from the second knuckle to the wrist joint, with a clean split and a small fall of lacquered dust. My hand was bare along a strip, perhaps 2 finger widths wide. The bioluminescent plating under my skin was, in that moment, running gold, not suppressed, not controlled. The warmth of the afternoon, and the vine and the quiet, and the man who had not stopped working when I came in, had gotten under the suppression I maintained constantly, without thinking, the way I wore the shell plate, automatically, as a habit, as the long practice prevention of the thing the court found complicated. And the channels were running gold. Through the fracture in the gauntlet, in a strip of bare skin 2 finger widths wide, the gold was visible. Moving slowly, like firelight in water. I sat very still. In the Capitol, in the delegation chambers, in the receiving rooms, in the corridors where chamberlains and visiting ministers walked, there would have been a response. The response would have been a rapid sequence of controlled actions designed to interpose something opaque between the light and the observers, and a polite, firm series of statements about the unfortunate and purely technical nature of the equipment failure, and a swift conclusion to whatever engagement was underway, and a report to Asif Thar. The response had been rehearsed until it was reflex. I could feel the reflex beginning the inclination to tuck the hand, to position the arm, to use the body to block the line of sight from the observer to the breach. Edric Tavin looked up from the cutting he'd been checking on. He looked at my hand. I braced for what comes next, which in 8 years had been one of 3 things: the flinch, the polite, deliberate look away, or the frozen over-control of someone who has decided not to react, and is working very hard at it. He looked at my hand and he said, "That's a beautiful color." Just that. The tone was the same tone he'd used to tell me about the vine plane. Direct. The tone of a man describing what he sees, because he sees it, and it is the appropriate thing to say about what he sees. Not performance. Not an attempt to put me at ease, which is a different thing, and I always know the difference. Not the aggressive warmth of someone compensating for discomfort. He said, "That's a beautiful color," the way he'd said 60 years old, that specimen, because it was true, and because saying true things about what was in front of you seemed, to him, like the natural way to proceed through an afternoon. I did not know what to say. He looked back at the cutting. "You'll want to wrap that gauntlet before the fracture runs. Cold wet cloth, if you have it, will stop the stress fracture tracking in the lacquer." He paused. "Or you can leave it. Depends on whether you need the whole piece or just the function." I looked at my hand. The gold moved slowly under my skin, and through the crack in the lacquer, it was visible in that narrow strip, and it did not look wrong. It looked the way the vine looked, the way a thing looks when it is doing what it does, without anyone having decided it should be doing something else. I said, "I don't think I need the whole piece right now." He nodded. "Right. More water if it continues to heat." He went back to his work. I sat on the bench with my cracked gauntlet and my bare strip of gold-lit skin and the sensation of the afternoon sun, and for the first time in 8 years, I did not immediately move to make the accommodating adjustment. I sat there, and I let the channels run warm, and I looked at the vine on the south wall and I breathed. After a while I said, "You were in the archivist's office 31 years. You would have known the provenance records for most of the house's holdings." "Most of them," he said. Did you ever catalog the living collections? The biological records? A pause. He was quiet, in the way of someone cross-referencing something. The early Velcaran species documentation, the biological materials were part of the treaty annexes, so they came through us, for the legal record. I said, then you've seen the plating records, the subdermal documentation. Another pause. Longer. He set down his tool. He turned and looked at me. Not at my hand, at my face. The expression was careful now, not alarmed, but careful in the way of a man who has just realized that a piece of information has rearranged itself, and he is deciding what the rearrangement means. Reth Solane, he said. Not a question this time. Yes, I said. Of the Solane line. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at my hand again, at the strip of gold visible through the cracked lacquer. Something moved across his expression that I could not name exactly. It was not pity. It was not the quick flicker of someone recalculating their position. It was something more like recognition. The way you recognize something you have read about and then one day encounter. And the encounter is different from the reading but confirms it. He said, the biological records note that the bioluminescent response in the senior Velcaran line is most active at high emotional amplitude, joy being the primary driver of the gold response. He said it the way he would have said a fact from an archive plainly, in the cadence of a man who spent 31 years reducing ambiguity. The documentation rated the visual intensity as significant, comparable to certain deep-water species. The court finds it difficult. I said. I imagine they do, he said. It would require looking at it. I did not know, in that moment, how to answer that. The channels shifted under my skin, a movement of warmth, that the fracture in the gauntlet translated into a faint pulse of visible light, gold running briefly brighter through the narrow opening, and then settling again. He saw it. He did not look away. I'm going to put the kettle on, he said. There's a table in the glass house. The afternoon light in there is reasonable, and the chairs are less hard than that bench. I said, all right. He went into the glass house. I sat for a moment longer on the bench, in the sun, and listened to the sound of water being drawn and the small sounds of a man who knew where everything was in his own space and moved accordingly. Then I picked up the pale green stem in its small terracotta pot, 3 leaves and a month of patience ahead of it, and I carried it with me into the glass house. The table was an old wooden work table pushed to one side, scarred with the history of repotting and soil and tools put down and picked up again. The 2 chairs were mismatched. One, a heavy garden chair that had been brought inside from the weather and never taken back out. One, a lighter chair, with a repaired leg. Edric Tavin put a clay kettle on a small heating element in the corner and set 2 cups on the cleared end of the table. And I sat down in the heavy chair and set the cutting in the center of the table, and we waited for the water to heat. The glass house in the late afternoon was amber. The glass panels caught the low sun and translated it into something close to the color my channels produce when I am at ease. And the warmth was different from the wall warmth of the garden enclosed, sustained. The specific warmth of a space that was heated all day by the sun and held it in the glass and the shelves of clay pots and the dark, rich soil. He poured the tea, something dried and fragrant, from a tin on the shelf that I suspected dated back years. He sat in the lighter chair with the repaired leg and held his cup in both hands and looked at the cutting in the center of the table. You've been at the provincial estates how long? He said. I arrived this morning. How many estates on the tour? Valith, and then 4 others, and then the coastal house at Velarath. That's 3 weeks. Roughly. Yes. He drank his tea. I drank mine. The fragrance was dried grass and something sharp beneath, the way old tea sometimes is when it has been stored a long time and has become something slightly more than what it started as. The Calder negotiation, he said. It was not quite a question. Yes, I said. 3rd round? 2nd extended session, I said. The 3rd will be in the autumn. And you were asked to be elsewhere for the duration. My chamberlain arranged an inspection of the provincial holdings, I said. which was the version I had been using, as an opportunity to develop a fuller picture. He did not say anything to that. He drank his tea. The not saying was precise. He had spent 31 years in an office, where documents arrived worded carefully, and he knew the difference between a statement's surface and its structure. After a moment he said, "The subdermal plating is a significant visual stimulus in mixed-species diplomatic contexts." I said, "That's the phrase." He said, "I know. I wrote the first version of it." I looked at him. 31 years ago, he said. There was a Velkaran trade consultation, second of that name. Pre-Calder. Different parties. The chief chamberlain at the time needed language for the protocol annex that would address the bioluminescent response in diplomatic settings without making the annex sound like what it was, which was a request for the Velkaran delegates to cover their hands. He turned the cup in both hands, slowly. I drafted the language. I thought it was neutral. I was younger. I sat with that. It was good language, I said. It was careful language, he said. There's a difference. The glass house was quiet. Somewhere outside the wall, one of my security escorts shifted position. I could hear the small click of boot heel on stone. The afternoon was beginning to tilt toward evening, the light through the glass changing from amber toward something deeper. I said, "The first chamberlain who put the shell plate on me told me it was for my dignity, that the court would find it easier to regard me as the title, rather than as a source of light." Edric Tavin looked at the fracture in my gauntlet. The gold was still running in that narrow strip. Slower now, the glass house warmth had settled the acute response, but the channels were still active. Still warm. "Did they?" he said. "Find it easier?" "They found it easier," I said. "I'm not sure what they found it easier to do." He nodded, slowly, once, in the way of someone acknowledging a point that does not require elaboration. I looked at the cutting on the table. 3 leaves, a pale green stem, root filaments barely visible at the drainage hole in the pot. A month from being ready for wall space. "It knows what it's doing," I said. He looked at the cutting, too, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way of a man who does not smile often, but does not suppress it when it happens. "It does," he said. We stayed like that for a while, the declining sun through the amber glass, the cups between our hands, the cutting on the table between us, and the gold still moving in the strip of my bare wrist. I did not cover it. He did not look away from it, and he did not look at it in the particular way people look at things they are being careful about not looking at. He looked at it the way he'd looked at the vine on the south wall, and the herb row he'd finished, and the cutting he'd checked, with the plain regard of someone who sees what is there and finds it worth seeing. It was the most ordinary thing that had happened to me in 8 years. It was also the most seen I had felt in 8 years. And those two things were, I was beginning to understand, not separate. After a while, he said, "The archivist's office keeps records of the species documentation going back 6 centuries. The Velkaran line has been part of the Solene Covenant since the original compact, so the biological records are some of the oldest in the collection." He drank his tea, unhurried. I used to read the old annotations. The archivists who preceded me, 3 and 4 generations back, wrote their observations in the margins. It was not approved practice, but it had become practice. He paused. One of them, a woman named HFY, who worked in the office nearly 90 years ago, wrote, next to the section on the bioluminescent response, "The gold amplitude at Joy Peak is, in this archivist's assessment, the most accurate visual record of a person's interior that any documentation system in the house collection has yet produced." I was quiet for a moment. "She wrote that in a margin," I said. "She did. In a very small hand, which is how archivists write when they know something belongs in the record, but are uncertain whether it belongs in the official record. What happened to the annotation when the document was recopied?" He looked at the cutting on the table. "It didn't survive the 3rd recopy. The copy archivist of that period kept only what was formally sanctioned." A pause. I transcribed it into the supplementary notes before I left. "It's there, if someone knows to look." I looked at my hand. The gold ran its steady current. HFY never met a Velkaran, I said. She was working from the species documentation. She was, he said. Which means she drew that conclusion entirely from reading about it. She never actually had to look at it. He turned his cup in his hands again. That's the thing about archivists. We develop opinions about things we've never seen. Sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes they're better than the people who were actually in the room. The afternoon light had shifted while we talked, the amber going deeper, and in the glass house, the warmth had settled to something sustainable, not the sharp sun warmth of the garden bench, but the enclosed warmth of a space that had stored the whole day's heat in its clay pots and wooden shelves and the dark soil of 100 specimens. Outside, the vine on the south wall was moving in a slow evening wind, the top of the mass just visible above the glass panels. I thought about HFY, 90 years dead, writing her observation in a margin and knowing it would probably not survive and writing it anyway. I thought about what it would mean to be a person who did that, who looked at the documented fact of the thing and wrote down what the fact actually said. In the small space between what was official and what was true, I thought about 8 years of shell plate. She was right. I said, I know, he said. I read the documentation and I thought so too, before today. He looked at my hand with the plain regard that I had come to understand. In the space of one afternoon was simply his way of seeing the way someone looks when they have spent a long working life reading what documents actually say, rather than what they have been organized to appear to say. Seeing it confirms it. Something in my chest moved. Not the channels, or not only the channels, which pulsed briefly brighter in the fracture strip. Something underneath, something older than the armor, and older than the court, and older than the language drafted 31 years ago, by a younger man who had not yet understood the difference between careful and neutral. You should have been a witness at the protocol annexes, I said. I was, he said. For the first 15 years. And then the annexes became what they became, and I was an archivist, not a diplomat. And what archivists are good at is the record, not the table. He picked up his cup and found it empty and set it back down. The record is longer than the table. That's some consolation. You transcribed HFY's annotation. I did. For the supplementary notes. Yes. Who reads the supplementary notes? He was quiet for a moment. Very few people, at present. It depends on what's being researched, and whether the researcher knows to look beyond the primary documents. He glanced at me with the expression of someone who has just decided a thing. Future archivists will read them. That's what supplementary notes are for. I held that thought. The gold ran slow and warm in my bare wrist. I used to think, I said, that the shell plate was a reasonable accommodation. When I was 14, it seemed like the smallest adjustment, the one that cost me least, and the room most. He waited. He was good at waiting, the waiting of someone who has read many documents and knows that conclusions on page 6 are not well understood without the context on pages 2 through 5. I see now, I said, that I had the accounting backwards. I was measuring the cost to me. I wasn't measuring what I was removing from the room. He thought about this carefully, in the way he thought about things, not rushing to confirm or to redirect, but sitting with the statement long enough to know what it actually said. The record, he said at last, would be incomplete without it. That's all. The room would be managing a less complete record of what was actually in it. That's a very archival way to put it. I'm a very archival person, he said. The corner of my mouth moved. The channels ran briefly gold, just briefly, just a pulse in the strip of bare skin, and then settled again to the deep, warm current that had been running all afternoon. The color that HFY had called, in her small margin hand, the most accurate visual record of a person's interior that any documentation system had yet produced. Outside, one of my security escorts appeared in the glass house doorway with the expression of a man who had received a communication and was navigating the balance between duty and his own clear read, that nothing threatening was happening in the center. glass house, which made it difficult to know how urgently to interrupt. "Your Highness," he said, "the Valeth steward asks me to notify you that your party's conveyance will be ready at the hour, and that the household has prepared the formal reception you requested." I had not requested a formal reception. Osifthar had arranged it. "Tell Terrace on the formal reception is appreciated but not necessary," I said. "A simple supper will be fine." The escort looked briefly relieved to have a clear instruction, and withdrew. Edric Tam set down his cup. I said, "I should ask you something before I go." "You should ask me whatever you want," he said, which was the plainest statement of courtesy I had encountered in some time, because it contained no implicit instruction about what I should and shouldn't want to ask. "The language you drafted," I said. "The protocol language. If you were writing it now, would you write it differently?" He considered this with the same precision he'd brought to the herb row, to the cutting, to his tea. "I'd write," he said slowly, "that the bioluminescent subdermal response in the Velkaran senior line presents a significant visual stimulus in mixed-species diplomatic contexts, and that the delegation should be prepared to encounter it, and that the appropriate response is to look at it, because looking at it is considerably easier than everyone in the room working very hard not to." I was quiet. "That's what I'd write," he said, "if I were writing it now." I looked at my hand. The gold was steady now, not the acute warmth response of the afternoon, but a deep, slow current, the kind that comes when something settles rather than surges. I picked up the cutting in its small pot. "I'll take this," I said. "Labels on the pot," he said. "Velarath thornless, cutting date, repotting date. It needs wall space and patience." "I'll find it both," I said. I stood. He stood not in the formal posture of someone rising for a titled visitor, but simply because the conversation was concluding, and standing seemed the natural response to that. He extended his hand, the wide-knuckled hand with the arthritis, and the 31 years, and the 8 years in the garden after, and I took it. And we shook hands the way people do when they have sat with each other in an honest afternoon, and there is nothing formal to add. His grip was careful, precise, the grip of a man who had learned to be gentle with fragile things. I walked out of the glass house with the cutting under my arm, the cracked gauntlet still unrepaired on my right hand, the gold still moving in the strip of bare skin. My escort fell in behind me without remark. The formal supper that Osifthar had arranged was small, in a provincial room that smelled of fresh flowers and careful preparation, and the steward Terrason gave a brief welcome, and the household staff served with quiet efficiency, and I ate and thanked them and retired early, which was my prerogative and which no one questioned. In my room, I set the cutting on the windowsill in the last of the evening light and looked at it for a while. 3 leaves, a month from being ready. I took off the right gauntlet. The fracture had tracked a little further in the late evening, a hairline running from the original crack toward the wrist seal, and the shell plate fell in 2 clean pieces, the safety design doing what it was meant to do, releasing along the pre-scored lines. My whole hand was bare. The gold ran slow and steady in the channels of my palm, my wrist, the backs of my fingers, the deep, warm current of something settled. I set the 2 halves of the gauntlet on the desk. I looked at my hand for a long time. In the morning I would put the spare gauntlet on and continue the inspection tour. I would go to 4 more estates, and then to the coastal house at Velarath, and the Calder negotiation would run its 2nd extended session, and then its autumn 3rd, and Osifthar would send me careful reports in language that had been drafted to say what it meant to say without saying what it was. And I would read them and reply in kind because I was good at that, because I had been practicing it since I was 14. But that was morning. That was the careful language. Tonight there was a cutting on the windowsill and gold moving in my bare hand in the lamplight, and outside the window the garden wall was dark, and the vine on the south face was a mass of deep green in the evening, and it had been there for 60 years, because someone had let it be what it was. I stayed at the window a long time. 6 months later I went back to Valeth. This time there was no inspection rationale. The Calder negotiations' third session had concluded favorable terms, Thar reported, which was his way of saying the Solene house had gotten what it wanted, and the capital was entering the quieter months. And I simply went. I sent word ahead that I would be arriving, and that I wanted to walk in the garden, and that the household should not arrange anything. I went without the gauntlets. I had the cutting with me. It had spent 6 months in a pot in my window, growing roots, and then a second stem, and then 3 more leaves, and I had given it wall space in the end, a section of the terrace wall at the back of my rooms in the Capitol house, where the afternoon sun hit the stone directly. The cutting was doing what cuttings do when you give them wall space and leave them alone. It was beginning to be the wall, but I had taken a new cutting before I left. Small pot, pale green stem, 3 leaves. It seemed like the right thing to bring. Edric Tavan was in the glass house when I arrived. He came out when he heard the gate, and he looked at me at my face, and then at my hands, and then briefly at my face again. I was wearing the full ceremonial shell plate, the shoulder pieces, and the arm pieces, and the chest plate, all the standard formal components of the Solene ceremonial grade. The gauntlets were what was missing. My hands were bare. The channels were calm, pearl blue, the steady hue of a cool morning, which is what I feel when I am not particularly feeling anything I need to suppress, just myself, at a morning temperature. He said, "You came back." I said I would. I said. He thought for a moment. "I don't think you did, actually." "Then I'm saying it now, after the fact." He looked at the cutting in my hand. "That's from the cutting I gave you," he said. "Second generation," I said. "The first is on my terrace wall." He took the small pot carefully, with the precise grip of a man who knew what a root ball required. He looked at the stem, the leaves, the soil. He tilted it to check the drainage. He turned it once to see the stem from all angles. "Good propagation," he said. "I had good instructions," I said. He looked at my hands. Not at the channels, or not only at the channels, which were running pearl blue and steady. He looked at my hands the way he'd looked at his own hands that first afternoon, with the plain regard of someone assessing what was in front of them and finding it as it should be. "Come inside," he said. "The kettle's already on." We sat at the work table again, the same mismatched chairs, and he poured the tea from the same tin, and I set the new cutting in the center of the table, and he set the first cutting beside it, and we sat with both of them between us in the amber afternoon light of the glass house. He said, after a while, "How was the negotiation?" "Long," I said. "But finished?" "This session. There will be others." He nodded. "There usually are. Thar is already working on the language for the next round," I said. "The protocol annexes." "Of course he is. I've asked to review them before they're finalized," I said. Edric Tavan looked at me over his cup. Something in his expression that was not quite a smile, and not quite surprise, but some third thing. The expression of a man encountering a fact that confirms something he had suspected, but not been certain of. "Good," he said. We drank our tea. The light came through the glass and ran across the table, and the 2 cuttings sat in the center of it, and my bare hands were warm around my cup, the channels running slow and pearl blue and unguarded, and there was nothing complicated about any of it. When I stood to go, he handed me the new cutting, the one I'd brought, and said, "This one's ready for wall space, if you have another section." "I'll find it," I said. I walked back through the garden in the late afternoon, the vine on the south wall going dark at the edges where the sun had moved past it, and I stood for a moment at the gate, the way I had stood in the center of the garden 6 months ago, listening to the quiet. I had been wearing the shell plate for 8 years. In the Capitol house, the morning after I returned, Thar would arrive with the draft protocol annex for the 4th negotiation session, which was already being scheduled for the following spring. The language would be careful. It would say, with considerable skill, what it meant to say without saying what it was. I would read it, and I would mark the section about the significant visual stimulus in mixed species diplomatic contexts. And I would write, in the margin, in my own hand. The appropriate response is to look at it. I did not know, yet, whether Osif Thar would keep the note or write around it. I did not know whether the fourth session would be any different from the second and the third. Change in diplomatic language moves slowly, in small increments, tracked by archivists, and read by people who know how to read what careful language is not quite saying. But I knew this. I had 2 cuttings from the vine on the south wall at Veleth, one of which was already beginning to be a wall of its own on a terrace in the capital, and the other of which I was carrying with me in a small terracotta pot with the propagation date and the instructions on the label. And a man with wide, careful hands had looked at the gold in my skin and said, "That's a beautiful color," in the plain tone of someone saying what they see because they see it. I carried that with me too. I turned away from the garden gate, and I walked back through the estate to the ground rail and the capital, with my hands bare and the cutting under my arm. Behind me, through the glasshouse glass, the amber light was still on,